When we look at that, right, so with the progesterone, you mentioned something quite interesting there around the fact that we can pick up on signals and we tend to be a bit more vigilant because that also is something that when we look at perimenopause, right, when progesterone, but this is different because this is when progesterone is dropping, right? At this point that you're talking about in the luteal phase, progesterone is high, but progesterone also seems to be linked with just anxiety when it drops. Like I remember that was one of the first things I was like, oh my God, where's this anxiety come from? I didn't used to have this.
The thing about progesterone is when it gets broken down by the body, it releases this neurosteroid called allopregnanolone, and it is really calming to the brain. So it actually activates your GABA receptors in your brain. And GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter that the brain uses to create different types of psychological experiences. And so one of the things that GABAergic activity is known for is for this really calming effect on the brain. So just to give some tangible examples of what it feels like to be under the spell of GABA, we have a lot of GABAergic activity after doing like yoga or meditating or like sitting by a fireplace or even drinking alcohol activates your GABA receptors. And so it has that sort of calming effect where you just, you feel really relaxed. And we get this like all natural, source of GABAergic activity from the release of progesterone. And so progesterone can have this really calming effect. And what you're describing in perimenopause is what happens a lot of times to women is the first thing that happens in perimenopause is that they have sort of a deficient corpus luteum and their levels of progesterone are really low. And the effect is that you're lacking this calming neurotransmission that your brain is used to, and that creates anxiety. And so a lot of that perimenopausal anxiety is the result of low levels of progesterone. And when you have low levels of progesterone, that means you also have low levels of allopregnanolone. And this is, something that does provide a potent source of anti-anxiety neurotransmission in the brain. And so lacking that can oftentimes make women feel like the wheels are coming off emotionally. And that type of anxiety also is something that sometimes women will experience within the course of a single menstrual cycle, especially in the late luteal phase. So, if you look at the luteal phase as a 2-week construct, which, we give or take, it's about 2 weeks, right? So the first half of that is progesterone levels rising, and then the second half is progesterone levels falling. And this can actually create very different sensations psychologically, just simply because of what it means to be experiencing your GABA receptors having increasing transmission. That feels calming, right? That's relaxing. But then when you have that being withdrawn because progesterone levels start to fall, then that can feel anxiety provoking. And so for, one of the things that I recommend for women in the book is that, really starting to understand your luteal phase and the way that you experience both progesterone rising and then progesterone falling, and not assuming that it's going to be a singular response, right? And that the way that we feel in the early part of the luteal phase may be different than the way that we feel in the later luteal phase, with one being like sort of more calming and tired, and the other one being a little bit more anxious and overwhelmed, and really starting to get a handle on your own relationship with this very potent but often undiscussed hormone.
Because you start to feel a bit edgy, right? And we see this in teenage girls, and it can be quite difficult for them, for example.
can also be difficult for their mothers.
For their mums.
Is what I can say as somebody with a teenage daughter.
This is true. And I think and then add a mum who's in perimenopause, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, and then you add the perimenopause piece in, and it's like it's funny because the teenage years really do overlap with many women's perimenopausal years, and it's like, could there be a worse combination?
Yeah. Exactly.
I don't think so.
That's when their partners just move out because they're just like, I can't take it.
Yeah, there's like, that's enough. I've had it.
Yeah. I'm done. Exactly. So when we're looking at, then you mentioned like how it's very calming, progesterone, and then it can also, as it drops off, we can get that anxiety. So that very late luteal phase, similar to perimenopause. What about PMS and PMDD? Because I know you've done a lot of research and a couple of chapters in the book dedicated to this around why so many women feel bad at the end of their menstrual cycle, at the end of the month.
One thing that's not really appreciated about the luteal phase is like just how wild and wide the hormonal swings are that we're experiencing at this time. And a lot of this has to do with the way that the menstrual cycle and the hormonal changes across the cycle are generally laid out. And I urge any of you listening right now, Google menstrual cycle hormones, and you're going to get a picture that looks like, it's going to show the 28 days, and then it's going to show this like rise and fall of estrogen during the first half of the cycle. And then it's going to show this rise and fall of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. And then there's also a little tiny, rise and fall of estrogen in the second half of the cycle as well. The thing that you don't know about that figure, and when you look at that figure, it's going to show the peaks of estrogen and the peaks of progesterone as being roughly the same size. But what you don't understand, and what most people aren't told, is that the way that they have these scaled is actually not drawn to scale, and that levels of progesterone are actually 10 times higher, and they peak at 10 times higher than peak levels of estrogen. And so if you actually had that picture drawn to scale, what you would see was this little tiny blip of this increase in rise and fall of estrogen in the first half of the cycle. And then in the second half, you have this big mountain that you're rising and falling of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. And then again, this little blip of estrogen changing in that time too. And most people don't realize that, like that the changes that we're experiencing hormonally in the second half of the cycle are, a magnitude higher than the changes that we experience in the first half of the cycle. And this takes a lot of flexibility, a lot of cellular plasticity to be able to adapt to. Because anytime that you have cells in your body, including the cells in your brain, that are sensitive to hormonal changes, they have to adjust to the changing levels of hormone, right? And so if there's a lot of hormone, they have to like down regulate their receptors so that way they don't get totally inundated by signal. And if there's not a lot of the signal, right, they have to sprout out new connections. So that way they're able to mop up as much of the signal as there is. And being able to have the cellular plasticity that's reaching out and grabbing hormone, right, and then retreating so it doesn't get totally flooded by hormone, that requires a lot of cellular plasticity. And that's something that, unfortunately, our contemporary environment is really good at eroding. Right. So a lot of us are lacking what I call resilience to hormonal changes, just simply because, the Western diet, our sedentary lifestyles, the fact that many women don't feel like they have sort of control over their lives, like they feel chronic stress. They don't, they're not able to invest in the relationships and the social support in their lives that they want to. All of these things have the effect of increasing inflammation and lowering our resilience to hormonal changes in ways that minimize our cell's ability to do this sort of like, grabbing onto hormone and then withdrawing. And we're not able to do that as quickly. And the result is that we can feel really terrible. And so one of the takeaways from the book is just that there's a lot that we can do to minimize the turbulence that we experience when we're going through periods of large hormonal change. And this is definitely something that we see with women who experience PMS, right? Is that because of a lack of cellular plasticity, they're not able to sort of ride the wave of the hormonal changes and then they feel terrible. But we also see this with perimenopause, right? Where women are having a really terrible time because their body is not as sort of resilient to hormonal changes. And the result is that they feel worse during perimenopause than they would need to if they were taking some simple steps to try to bring back some of that resilience. And we know that it's a similar set of mechanisms, because generally when you look at the research, it seems to show that women who are at a greater risk of experiencing PMS and PMDD, so women who have really bad experiences as they're transitioning through the luteal phase, they're also the ones who are most at risk for developing postpartum depression. They're also the ones who are most at risk for developing mental health related issues during perimenopause. And so it seems that, having sensitivity, like heightened oversensitivity to hormonal changes, is something that puts women at risk during these inflection points, right when hormones are changing very rapidly. But the good news is that there are things that we can do to try to increase our resilience to hormonal changes, and then make that, less like falling off driving off the side of a cliff, and instead make it more like riding a smooth wave as we transition through these different phases, both of our cycle and of our lives.